So I'm Oscar, as Vijay said. I'm a founder of a living game publisher. That means we're a modern publisher that focuses on games which have live operations, ongoing retention, basically ongoing revenue. In fact, I loved the speaker who came before me. I think it was Pearl. What she was talking about, shipping games, getting them out in front of people early, testing using data. I love all that. A lot of that's going to come out in this, and hopefully some of the questions you might have running through your mind as a result of that talk, I may be able to at least answer or at least provide some kind of pointers. My background's been explained, so I'm not going to go into any detail on that. But yes, I did write a book on the topic of games as a service. So what am I going to do? I am going to talk you through three things. We're going to validate our game idea. I'm going to start by looking at direction. I'm going to then look at data. And then we're going to talk about design. So we've got these three things that we're going to talk about. It may or may not be in that actual order. We will see as we get through. So why am I talking about direction? I think that before you start validating your idea, you need to know what you're doing and why. You've got to have an understanding of what your expectations should be. The expectations for a Supercell style billion-dollar game from a studio of that caliber is very different from an indie studio trying to get their first portfolio game out. So we need to understand what success looks like. And this is one of the things I do with a lot of teams. So I've got a long history of doing consultancy with game studios. We actually do an education program that we help with a lot of accelerators. And one of the first things I do is I sit there at a workshop and I get the founders of a studio to sit down and say to themselves, honestly, what does success look like? Is it about communicating ideas? Is it about the love of a genre that they've got? Is it about just making money? And frankly, if it is just about making money, go into banking. It's easier. This is going to be the hardest thing to make money on the planet. And yeah, it's still the most fulfilling, and I wouldn't do anything else. Is there a market opportunity? And you want to write down all of these things, but then pick three. Pick three only, the top priority, the most important things that matter to you. Put a number to them, a KPI. Because then your future decisions that you're going to make about your game, the validation that you're going to do, the way that you're going to check if this game has legs is by making sure that those metrics are actually working. So if you want to be focusing on communicating an idea, is that making sure that when you do a user testing experience and you get a survey, that spontaneously people pop out that message you're trying to get across. If it's about professional accolade, when you submit it to, say, a big indie pitch or you submit it to an award scheme, do you win? Do you win an award? Now, I mean, it's always very difficult saying, I'm going to build a game that's going to win awards. That's a bit difficult. But the idea of understanding what your metrics are behind your decisions means that you're putting some substance behind what it is you're trying to do. And again, what are you trying to make? Are you trying to make the fidget spinner, the hyper casual experience? Or are you trying to make this long-term engaged MMO-like or living game experience? And actually, there's somewhere in between as well. There's understanding your players' delight, your immediacy of the experience, and how you then build on that engagement is a serious matter. It's a really important matter. I think the previous speaker mentioned this, is like when you release a game, what happens next? 78% of the games market is in digital gaming, is in online games as a service. Think about that. 78% is already in games as a service. And on Steam, of the 24 platinum games in January 22, 24 platinum games in 22, 22 of them were games as a service. So thinking about long-term retention for your game is critical for a success, but not every game is going to be done the same way. So for example, if you've got a beautiful nugget of joy that is a start, middle, and end narrative, that's fine. You've got to understand the market for that, the scale of that, and that it has a short-term revenue model. and build your planning around that principle. But if you've got a game that's got beautiful grind and then moments of joy, that's got this sense of purpose and progression that keeps you playing month by month by month, that's a different model to validate. Hopefully that makes sense. So we're talking about our decision, our direction so far. Now we're going to talk about audience. So understanding your audience is really key. And again, I think this is something that we often forget about. We often make games because we want to make this game. We saw that particular game, or we played that particular game in our childhood. We want to make that again. Wouldn't that be amazing? Well, no, actually, because we're not making games for us because, well, if you do, it's called a hobby. We hopefully want to have an audience. I'd like to get paid so I can make the next game at least. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not somebody who wants to sit there and just rake in cash off a gambling machine, because that's not my interest. I mean, if that's yours, fine. But let's work out what it is we're doing. So if you're going to make a game that's going to have a wide audience, it's going to be scalable, we need to think about scaling to the audience. We need to think who they are. And this is a technique called personas. It's one of many ways of identifying an audience. I happen to like picking out 3 different people. I happen to like layering my audience against the different stages of the game. So I like to think about my primary audience, my first audience, as somebody who I'm going to design the core mechanics for, somebody who will love this core mechanic, who will continue to play this core mechanic, even if that was the only thing that was there. And in this case, I've got Ahmed, and I've got what he sees, what he thinks. He thinks he could have been an esports player. It could be, he feels kind of less engaged. He wants games with more guns. There's some things about his characteristics. Now, have I got that? Well, there are different ways. One is I could look at data. And if I can look at data, that's fantastic. But I often don't have data when I start. So I start with a hypothesis. I start with a guess. This is my guess. Then I've got Jackie, who I do for a second audience. Now, my second audience, I assume, is somebody who's not my primary. They're not just going to be delighted by my mechanic, and that's going to be enough to keep and retain them over the long term. They're going to need a sense of purpose and progression. They're going to need something deep about the interplay between sessions, something about optimization, perhaps, something about narrative, perhaps. And that person, that secondary person, I try to incorporate in my design thinking. The reason is that if I look at my game design from the perspective of Ahmed versus the perspective of Jackie, now I can see the differences, the different perspectives of how somebody might look at my game. I can start questioning my assumptions about the game and focus on the delight of the player. And the third audience I use for the social layer. Actually, a bit more than that. I call it the meta game, but I'm talking about the lifestyle fit. What is the daily routine of a player going to be with your game? Have you built this coffee morning moment where I have a break, I'm going to have a coffee or whatever my decision is to choose to rest, and I'm going to play a 3-minute game? Well, if that's the type of game you're making, then you're going to have a certain type of audience. The device you're going to probably be using is probably a mobile phone. There are certain decisions about the design that have to make sure they fit. Even little things like, have you tried holding your phone in landscape mode for more than a minute or two? It's awkward. It's painful. So if you're making a mobile game and you're choosing to go landscape mode, you're going to find you're going to lose a huge proportion of your audience. That's a lifestyle decision. That's a lifestyle fit thinking. So again, that's the sort of stuff. But equally, another game, I might be wanting a game that I'm going to escape. I'm going to go up to my spare room. I'm going to sit on a laptop. I'm going to sit on a PC, and I'm going to have that experience. Or maybe I'm going to a cafe and then I'm going to pull out a tablet. The thinking about the lifestyle fit, thinking about the social collaboration, all of this stuff is really important. So who is the person? Who's the personality that exemplifies that? Through whose eyes you can see the longer term. Now, the joy of this way of thinking about it is not only are we getting 3 different perspectives, but each of those perspectives have a momentum that allow us to think about the longevity of the game as well. So from a design point of view, If we ignore who's going to play it, if we don't think in detail about who and why and where and when they're going to play it, if we don't think about what they see, think, feel, and do, because they are different things, do we really understand our audience? And equally, this comes into marketing later, because if I don't know who I'm targeting, I don't know where to optimally put my ads. I don't know where optimally to create my social communities. And those things are going to be critical for your success, particularly now with post the IDF, now we no longer have Apple's mechanism. The ATT is getting something like 30% of gamers signing up to getting ads data. That's had a profound negative impact on our ability to target mobile games, but it's also had a knock-on effect on Android games. And it's also had an effect on targeting generally, not just games, not just on mobile. So we have this cooling effect that's particularly profound on mobile. So we're starting to see people thinking about techniques that used to be on PC and mobile, and techniques on mobile now being tested on PC. Anyway, I don't want to go into marketing talk. That's a different subject, but that's why this persona stuff is so important. If you're validating your game, knowing knowing who your audiences could be and where they are, and that they are targetable, all makes the difference to your chances of success with your game. You need to build it into your design. Next up, I'm going to start talking about design. There you go, design. So remember I talked about mechanic, context, and metagame. Now, this is my model. You could ignore it as you will, but this is my model for the game design. And at the heart of my model, I've got the core mechanic. That is the start condition, the challenge, the resolution, and the reward. Very simple. Every game has got one. Even Farmville, that was accused of having no game mechanic, had one. Although the challenge wasn't what you thought it was. The challenge was, does my farm look sucky? And do other people think my farm is sucky? And it doesn't seem like a normal thing, but I can bore for hours on that. That's for another time. But every game's got those 4 characteristics. But what you've got to think about is not just those 4 characteristics. You've got to think about the emotional journey of the player. As you review your game, even without having to go to anybody else, even without having to test it, can you look at your game and say, the player enters the game in a relaxed state, the relief state. They enter the game with anticipation. That's what the start condition should feel like emotionally. As we introduce the challenge, the objective that the game has, are we introducing a sense of tension? If we're not, why would anyone play the game? Honestly, why would you? If you don't, where's the interest? Where's the desire? So we've got to stay in the world of anticipation as we shift from start condition to challenge. But equally, when we go from challenge to resolution, so we're actually doing the things that I need to do to complete the challenge, we need to move away from anticipation. We're no longer anticipating what's happening in the game. We should now be getting to fear of missing out. Because if we don't succeed, if we've got the tension and the fear of missing out, then we've got the motivation to keep engaged in the game and do the things in the game that need as an intense and delightful thing to do. And then we get into relief as we get our reward. Tricky thing here is that if we then satisfy the player perfectly, what happens? We end up them leaving the game, they're done, they're satisfied, thank you very much, dun dun dun. But we want them to come back. We want them to keep playing. We want them to go to the next thing. So we've got to keep the player in the fear of missing out, even as we're giving them rewards, even as we're helping them feel relief. So that's how we create a loop, a cycle, not just by saying player does this, does that, does this. Who cares? Where emotionally is the player in the mechanic? And I apply the same principle for the context loop. The context loop for me is the sense of purpose, the progression, but also optimization. You know those games where you're tinkering. I'm talking about Fallout 76 a lot as an example for this, because when Fallout 76 came out, it was terrible. But now it's one of my favorite games. Why? Because I have these moments where I'm having to go off and do various things and tinker with things to upgrade my armor, get more ammo, fix my weapons, get food, so I'm ready to go and take on the next mission. that grind makes the game fun, because the grind is leading me up, building my anticipation, building up my excitement to the point where I'm now fully optimized. And now I go in and I complete a mission. That mission is clearly a challenge that is overcome, and I feel brilliant because of it. So thinking about the purpose, progression, optimization, and narrative in the same emotional direction can really help you understand, is your game solid? Again, remember, we're just looking at our game internally at this point. And then the last thing is the meta game. Now, obviously, some people call the context loop, what I call context loop, some people call meta. I don't think that's a good idea. I won't bore you with why. You can make your own decision about how you want to look at your game. But for me, the meta game is that's not the game. It's about the lifestyle fit I talked about earlier. It's about collaboration. And to my mind, if you think about that in the emotional journey, it fits. You go from relief and anticipation when you're looking at the lifestyle fit, because I want to feel naturally good. Yes, of course I'm going to go and pick up my phone as I'm on the toilet. Sorry, on the bus. Yeah, most people play games on the toilet. Anyway, enough said. If it's a PC game, I've got to choose. If it's my console game, I am going to be taking over the TV in my front room. I have to feel comfortable doing that. If I don't feel comfortable doing that, I won't do it. So making people feel comfortable as they start, getting them to anticipate, getting them to sense the collaboration, and that building some tension about the excitement about what the game can do, but what they will need to do. Creating competition can be incredibly intense and important. And then if you do that right, and we make the game something that other people will look at and go, that looks cool, then we can tie that back into marketing. Because we don't get content creators showing off our game if we don't create moments where they can show it off. So that's the sort of thing I think about with reviewing the game from a design point of view. But it's not just about the concept of the design. It's not about the high-level design. It's also about, do we have extensible interactions, small moments that can be enhanced through power-ups, that reflect my skill, that allow me to show off my capacity, that encourage my brain to work, the hand-eye coordination. You need these moments in a game that you can then tap into, that makes the player feel that they are in control, their autonomy. One of the main reasons people play games is because of that sense of autonomy. Games are verbs. They are not nouns. We do in a game. And if we lose sight of that, if we try to make a film using game mechanics, we come unstuck. Even though The Last of Us is one of the best games out there in so many ways, it really frustrated me when they took the narrative away from what I wanted to happen. They destroyed the immersion because they made Joel make a decision I fundamentally disagreed with. And that is the danger if you try to make narrative linear that takes away the autonomy of the player. Anyway, I'm not trying to be a downer on Last of Us. It is an amazing game, and that's an amazing team. But I'm just trying to get across the point that think about the immersion, think about the engagement. The more autonomy and control a player has, the easier. And you've got to assess that. Do you have that in your game? If you are just following what the designer thought, you are going to limit the scope of the game. Is the art suitable for the IP? Is there a match? Is there a cognitive sense between, remember the audience we've just identified, those 3 players that we've hypothesized and will improve over time by using data? Will they get the art? Will it connect them to the game? Will it ingrain them in the game? And there's a whole bunch of work that's gone out there. This is a piece of work from Game Refinery looking at art styles. There's lots of tools out there. The other thing to look at, to assess the success of your game, and again, we're looking at the design side here, internal perspective, is the game economy. Break your game down into its sinks and sources. So I look at the player, I look at the thing that we do, the action, the play, I look at progression, I look at rewards, I look at offers. Now, offers generally, not always, but offers are generally premium, paid elements. Whether you're paying up front in the game, whether you're paying outside, inside the gameplay, so in-app purchase type stuff, or using ads. I actually think about the whole economy from Am I going to be exchanging through time? Am I going to use currency that I earn through play? Am I going to use real money? Is it going to be a subscription or a battle pass offer which increases my effectiveness through play? No, don't do pay to win though. There is no such thing as pay to win. Pay to win is a broken game. So if somebody can buy success, their game is dead. It's just not going to work. There's arguments over that, but it's not the kind of game I want to make. You can build in anchors, things that can only be gained through gameplay to avoid some of that problem. You can also build in ratchets. Ratchets are like prerequisites you have to have before you can obtain an item. But think about what the sinks and sources. Where do you get items like consumables? Do you get them through rewards? Do you buy them as booster packs? Then where do you spend them? Think about the exchanges in the game. And you need to do this anyway, because you need a balanced economy to make your game work, even if it's just how the XP works, how the energy works, how the progression works. All of that stuff needs to be done anyway. So let's just extend that and think of your monetization as part of that process. If it doesn't feel real, if scarcity doesn't make sense inherently in your game design, your economy is going to break. And if you're going to make a game, particularly a game that's got purchases, if you haven't paid attention to the game economy, your game isn't going to be working. So I've talked a lot about the internal perspective here, the internal view of what you can do. Let's move a little bit forward and let's start talking about data. So there's lots of sources of data, lots of types of data. You've got things like Playtest, Cloud, and Antidote. This is online user testing teams that I thoroughly recommend. We tend to use Antidote for PC and Playtest Cloud for mobile. We've got a great relationship with both of them. Thoroughly recommend them. They're a very effective way to recruit, say, 6-10 people to play your game and to give you a survey. You get often you get recordings of gameplay. Sometimes you'll get the audio of them speaking as they play. If you can get that, get that. That's amazing. It really helps you understand what's going on. Now, this is what we call qualitative testing. Qualitative because we understand the qualities, the emotional responses. It's not great for statistical significance. So don't try to have 100 people on a user test like this, because it's going to inherently be biased, because they're generally paid to do the test. So that will bias their behavior. What it's great at, though, is understanding what real people do when they play your game. You can look at the pathways, you can look at the obstacles, you can look at where they fall down, what they misunderstand, and that is gold. But more importantly, you get to ask them a question. In fact, 3 questions in a row. Did they enjoy playing the game? Would they play the game again? Would they recommend to a friend? If you ask those 3 questions in a row, they're going to lie about whether they enjoyed the game because they don't want to hurt your feelings. They're going to lie about whether they would play it again, but because you've given the chance to lie twice, they're not going to lie the 3rd time. They're going to give you a much more honest answer about whether they'd recommend it to a friend. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. So that's what we call an NPS test, or a Net Promoter Score test. That's a term used in wider marketing outside of games, but basically user testing, amazingly helpful. You could go and do biometrics, testing people's sweat reactions, testing their eye, the dilation of their pupils, things like that. All of that is great if you can afford it, but generally, unless you're a Sony or a Ubisoft, it's just not worth the iterative improvement of information that you get, in my opinion. There's other things. So, for example, attribution. So if you're doing promotions, ads to get people to install your game, you want to set up an attribution partner. That could be a Kachava, it could be a Steam Data Suite. Kachava, we tend to use for mobile apps. Flyer is another example where you're able to sort of track. AppsFlyer is a little bit more expensive, but probably a bit more solid, a bit more traditional. Kachava I find useful, mostly because there's a free version. Steam Data Suite allows me to do that for Steam games. So I can see when I run a marketing campaign, where did they come from? And you can tap that into your game data to an extent, as long as you're careful with the anonymous nature, so you don't create problems for your GDPR or your other privacy regulations that you have to pay attention to. it can be really helpful. But point is, that's giving us information about what audiences we're getting and how effective our marketing is. The user testing, the Places Cloud and Antidote give us information about what do people feel. Then you've got to have in-game data. I'm increasingly looking at things like raw databases rather than game analytics or Delta DNA. Game analytics and Delta DNA are great, by the way, they're fine. I like raw data, and I'm struggling to get that raw data out of the platforms. So I'm increasingly asking devs to basically put their data into, say, something like PlayFab as their backend. If you've got a backend server, something like PlayFab is quite good. And then you can take all your data and put it onto, say, an Azure Blob or an S3 AWS server. Just sticking your data somewhere safe that you can draw, create dashboards, amazing. Then you can start understanding what's going on in the game. You can look at an event trigger, say level starts. But it could be level event. A level event could be a start. A level event could be an ends. A level event could be you take a major action, like you shoot an opponent. Each of those triggers then have a set of parameters. So what level was it? What was the player ID? Anonymous session ID, by the way. You don't want to have attributable data in your telemetry. Anything you need to know about the person, keep in account data, because at some point someone's going to turn around and say you got to delete it, and if you don't delete it, you can be fined something like 20 million euros or 4% of your global turnover, whichever is larger. Yeah, data seriously expensive if you screw it up. So anyway, this is kind of the kind of scare story, but it's you can do it sensibly. Separate personally identifiable the stuff that you have to have, and only the stuff that you have to have in account data, and then have an anonymized version of that data in the telemetry. That way we can say they started the level. What of the people who started this level, how far did they get? Did they complete? What was the win-loss ratio, etc., etc. Now that matters. Win-loss ratio in a game is a major indicator to the monetization effectiveness of the game. If you're too high, people don't buy anything. If it's too low, people don't buy anything. You got to find what is the Goldilocks spot, the just right spot in your game that creates enough tension of play, enough anticipation, but still feels accessible. So data, massively important. There's another type of data we haven't talked about, which is about understanding the market. For example, Game Refinery is really good at telling me what other games are there out there like my game, and actually I can use that to get some attributable data. It is very expensive. To do the stuff I'd like to do, it's going to cost 40 to 50k a year. So that's problematic. Steam Data Suite is free. Well, it's not quite free. Steam Spy. Steam Spy, I can get data by paying a few £100 into the Patreon for the guy who does Steam Spy. I think it's really useful because it lets me know for PC games a ballpark level. There are some major problems with the way data is collected. In fact, the same problems apply whether you're using SenseTower, Game Refinery, App Annie, whatever else it might be. Because they're looking at the ranking, they're looking at games that are plugged into their system, and they're making an assumption about the ratio what other games in the ranking will be. So there's a lot of ambiguity. I had one game, I happen to know the team well. I asked them how well the App Annie, Apptopia, I think I was using at the time for that one. And apparently the Apptopia was presenting them as generating nearly twice the amount of revenue they actually were. So it can be super out, but it can still be useful. So what do we do with this data? Whatever source we get it from. Well, we download it and we start looking at it. We look at the number of, this is an old piece of data I took from Candy Crush. I think I downloaded it in 2020. Basically looked at the downloads and revenue. This was using a system called Reflection, sadly no longer with us. It's got shut down. It was owned by Game Refinery. I could then extract this data with the number of downloads and the amount of revenue per day. I could do that for 10 different games of the same subgenre, and then I could build what was the average model. Therefore, I could basically work out in a very simple spreadsheet what was the likely possible revenue for my game. Now, it's not a forecast. It's simply a way of saying, if the average of 10 games in this subgenre make this much money and have this many downloads, that's what success can look like. That's what the market is currently bearing. It also gives you a lovely graph of the likely adoption path as well. So it's a really useful way of working. If you have access to an Apptopia or an App Annie or a Game Refinery, I thoroughly recommend using that type of approach, but it's not cheap and not for everybody. Next thing is you can do the same thing on Steam Spy, but the trouble with Steam Spy, and there are others, by the way, so SteamDB is another one. The trouble with Steam Spy is, again, the mechanism they use to calculate what the number of downloads and the amount of average revenue is very kind of difficult, particularly because they will show you the number of owners and it will go up and down. So suddenly you've got to work out, have we lost 1,000 people, 10,000 people playing that game or not? Or did they just time out because they had a free account and weren't using it? So you've got to take all data with a pinch of salt when you're using third-party data. But it's super useful. Any third-party data you get, Newzoo can tell you what the market's looking like, what the growth's looking like. Sensor Tower can give you market understanding. Always pay attention to conferences like this where people will share useful information. Use that to help create benchmarks, KPIs, key performance indicators that you're going to use to measure your likely success. In fact, when you're building a model for your game, work out what assumptions you need to make and see if you can do not just a top-down. Like these are what we call top-down models that we build from the raw data. I also do bottom-up models where I look at the assumptions based on what are the KPIs I'm expecting. Look at the game. How much revenue can that game make if those KPIs are true? So moving swiftly on from that, I'll give you some examples. So these are example data targets. So when we're doing tests, I might do a Facebook test where I'm going to do a 30-second ad. I may not even have a full game yet. I may just have a trailer that exemplifies what the gameplay could feel like. I might have 2 or 3 versions of the art. Now, this is a very hyper-casual way of working. We happen to use it for living games as well. I get that trailer out, whatever stage the game's at. I try to make sure that trailer represents what a real game trailer would look like. I may point to an app store, particularly the early access part of Google or Steam. If I happen to have a game at a level that's playable, if it's got at least an hour's worth of gameplay, I'm going to want to do that because I'm going to want to work out what does my day one retention look like. But I'll put a real ad, I'll do real targeting, but I'll spend a tiny amount of money. I'll spend, say, £50 a day for 3 days. That's it. And I'll do comparisons where I can. So, for example, if I was doing a hyper-casual game, I would have 10 ideas. I would then I would reduce those 10 ideas to 2 ideas. I would do 2 mechanic variations. I would do 2 art style variations. I'd end up with 4 ads, 30-second ads based on those ideas. I would then test those, each spending £150 for 3 days on each one with sensible targeting, and I'd see which one did the best. But there are some KPI indicators that I think are worthwhile considering. So, for example, here, I'm chucking out what I think are reasonable targets. They are not necessarily indicative of averages, but these are based on me listening to lots of different conferences and seeing what other people do, plus looking at my own data and seeing what I think works and what makes sense. So CPC, cost per click. CPI, cost per install. If I'm getting less than 60 cents CPC, I'm happy. Now, I'm unlikely for that to be 60 cents cost per install. If I do get that, I'm very, very happy. But the likelihood is your cost per install is going to be higher because not everybody you get to go to the App Store or the website is going to sign up. So knowing there's a difference is important. Good for me is under $1, and the CPI being under $1.50. That's what I consider to be good. Mid means that I would carry on developing. I would carry on trying to improve. I wouldn't necessarily kill, but I'd be very suspicious. I might only do one more test if I don't see a rate of change that's positive. And that's around the £1.50 for the cost per click and about the £2.50 CPI. Now, different games are going to have different targets. In some games, particularly on mobile games, I'm going to make that target a little bit more stringent. it's a bit difficult at the moment because I used to have different numbers for mobile than I did PC. I'm now seeing better results in terms of cost per install on PC than I am on mobile. So we recently did a game where only in test, but we were getting a 33 pence cost per click and a 68 pence cost per install on a PC game on Steam. Now, is that sustainable? Who knows? We'll find out. But thinking about it in this way, think about this data-driven mindset where you set a goal, a hypothesis, before you run the ad, before you run the test, and then you see what happens. Now, I've just been talking about the ads part. Let's talk about the game part. Retention matters. Retention has a disproportionate effect on the success of a game. Looking at day 1, day 2, day 3, day 7, etc. matters. Then if you've got ads and you've got retention and you've got revenue, let's look at the revenue, average revenue per daily active user. That's a really useful indicator. By the way, there are lots of other indicators you could look at, but I find revenue opt-out a really interesting one. These numbers are actually typical for mobile, but there are going to be equivalents for your game. Don't just take these numbers and say these are the right numbers to aim for. This is just try to indicate to you the kind of numbers that we use when we're considering the success and the validity of a game. And we're doing this test before we launch. We're doing this test to limited numbers of players. Like I say, spending small amounts of money until we prove our numbers are good enough before we then push the game in market seriously. We will be also using this to recruit people to test. We'll be also using this to start building up a community, get people excited in advance of launch. And anyone know what ROAS means? Any hands out there? Yeah, there's a couple of hands out there. I don't know if the mic's available. It'd be great to hear if somebody could say that. Not sure if the mic's coming your way or not. I'll say it to save you the embarrassment. So ROAS is return on advertising spend. Oh yeah, I've destroyed the.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, go for it.
A lot of the studios generally prefer a much lower CPI, say like less than 40 cents or so. But how do you guys work with the CPI if it's like lower than $1? So how does that work for you?
Yeah, I mean that's even better. I mean, basically, the cheaper we can get, the better. But post IDFA, we're seeing that that's more expensive, particularly in UK and US markets. Now, bear in mind, we're not doing hyper casual games. Hyper casual games, there's a whole different ballpark. So, like you say, I'd be looking for 30 cents as my optimum. I'd probably be looking at 40 cents as my good if I was doing hyper casual. Does that make sense? Cool. And then ROAS. Now, by the way, this is another. Just to your point there, ROAS. The numbers I've got here are for living games. They're not for hyper casual games. Hyper casual games is all about volume. It's all about ad flow. It's you know that people are going to churn. You need to make sure that you get lots of data, lots of ads, lots of spend, lots of growth, and you can also get cross promotion. So there will be different stats for your games, but work out what the stats are for your game. What makes sense for your game. Now I'm out of time, I think. So with that in mind, I'm just going to quickly skip through some things that we do in a game report when we review a game. Just very quickly. We look at the market fit. So things like, has it got a targetable audience? Is the IP relevant for the subgenre? Does the game stand out in the market? We look at game design. We look at, is it compelling? Does it have extensibility? Does it have purpose and progression? Does it fit lifestyle? We look at monetization. Does it focus on player utility? Do the things that players care about and want and love? Does it fit the platform and the genre? Does it have good hybrid monetization where relevant? These are the kinds of things we look at when we're reviewing a game. Now, what I'm hoping at the end of that you've got is you can look at this game, any game, but you have to start by looking at why you're doing it. What is your direction? That allows you to frame what success looks like. What it is that you're making and who you're making it for. If you do not know what it is you're making and who you're making it for, you cannot assess the ability of your game because it's meaningless. That's going to set all of those KPIs I've been talking about. So we're going to define and change those KPIs because what success looks like for Supercell is not necessarily what success looks like for Rami and Nuclear Throne. So there's that. Then you can do a lot of introspection, looking at the game. We can look at the mechanics design and look at the emotional journey of the player and the game economy. Really taking a serious hard look at your game design and making sure that it actually does what the audience needs is going to matter. And lastly, data, data, data. Do not trust the highest paid person in the room to say that your game is good. Your game is only good if an audience tells you it is. The way we find out is by looking at those key performance indicators, by looking at what is day 1 retention, what is day 7 retention, what is day 30 retention, what is return on advertising spend, what's the average revenue per daily active user, what's the CPC, the cost per click, what's the CPI, cost per install. Those variables are super massive. And if I wanted to chuck another one at you, my favorite one I'll leave you with, my favorite KPI of all is percentage of repeat payers. Because if I've got a game that's got a high percentage of repeat payers, then I know that not only have I got a game that's great and they're enjoying, but they're actually enjoying the things I'm selling. Anyway, that's me done. I think I'm out of time. Someone will tell me otherwise. I'm happy
yes, you
to
are out of
answer
time,
any
Oscar.
questions. Yeah, okay.
So sorry. I didn't mean to cut
No,
you
that's
off.
fine. If anyone wants to get hold of me, there's my email. I'm on Twitter. I'm very happy to take questions. I've actually got a Discord if anyone wants to come and talk to me on Discord. I'm actually going to be running an AMA this afternoon, UK time, on our Discord. If anyone wants to join that, you'll be more than welcome to join it. I'm very happy to talk to people moving forward.
Oscar, I know we're out of time, but would you like to take maybe 1 or 2 questions from the audience?
I'm very happy to take whatever you need.
Okay, great.
for
But
it.
before we, can we get a round of applause for Oscar Clark? Great. So we have time for just maybe 2 questions. Do we have anybody who would like to? Yeah, please do.
Hi, Oscar. I had
Hiya.
a question for you. Is there a way to understand if your game is good or not during the documentation phase where you're actually writing down what your game is all about and not going to a publisher? Not getting the opinion of a publisher.
That's what that design phase is for. So when I talked about design, if you start off by working out what your direction is, you start off who your audience is, and then you use that mindset as you look through the design structure of the game, that will inform, to a certain extent. There's no magic like, now I know it works, it's all good. But you can do enough to understand that this game does what it says on the tin, does the thing it's supposed to do. And that's why I want to get you to think about the emotional journey through the loops. So, going back to the loops, it's this part that I personally think is the best way to get started on that. Because if you need to question your game. You need to think about, in the core mechanic, is there a clear start condition? Is there a clear challenge? Does that challenge set you up emotionally to go from anticipation, so looking forward, to when you start doing the thing, the tension, the kind of frustration and fear of missing out? I've got that desire to complete. If there is no challenge, and challenge can be very different for very different kinds of games. Farmville, the challenge was to make sure my farm didn't look boring. And that's not a hugely high threshold game, but something like Dark Souls, you died. That is the challenge level that happens in a Dark Souls game. So each game has its own threshold. The reason why you'll go, that works or not, is because you've thought about your audience. And that's what's going to clarify. But don't trust your instincts. Put it into a trailer. Put that trailer out onto Facebook or some other mechanism and see how many people click on it and go to download the game. Even if the game doesn't exist, point them to a website. You're just getting the cost per click of somebody clicking on an ad to go to a website gives you an indication of how attractive that idea is. And you don't need to go to a publisher to do that. Although actually, to be frank, we do that when we're publishing games. We get that as part of our evaluation, is to make sure that the game has good day 1 retention and a good cost per click, cost per install.
Thank
Does
you,
that answer
Oscar.
the question?
We have time for maybe one more question. Anyone else be interested in asking a question? Otherwise, Oscar is available on social media. Feel free to reach out to him anytime.
Yeah.
As mentioned, he also has a Discord session later today, Oscar, UK time.
Yeah, that's right. Between 1 to 3 UK time.
Awesome. Okay, great. Doesn't seem like we have any more questions right now. Once again, thank you so much, Oscar. I really wish we could have had brought you to IGDC this year, but I greatly appreciate. I think all of us greatly appreciate you spending the time to give this virtual talk here today.
It's all right. And glad. So sad I wasn't there, but such is life. Next time.
Take care,
Cheers,
Oscar.
guys.
Have a great day.
Bye then.